Today's daf is daf Dalit. And we'll start with Amar Rav Papa on the second line. And we're talking about the Shita of Rav Huna here on daf Gimel Amid Beis, that in order to establish a person as a shota, that he's part for mitzvahs and onchim, he has to have and exhibit all three simanim. Not one or two, but all three. Each mia leila Rav Huna ha desanya. It could be that Rav Huna would have changed his position had he only known about a brisa. And the brisa reads the following: Ezi shota kol zeh ma'abed kol ma shenosnim lo. You give him something of value, and he destroys it. He throws it out. And the previous brisa that we had on the previous Amud of Gimel Amud Beis had listed three simanim, and they were different simanim than this one for a shota. And it seems that those simanim are not what you call bedafka. It's only what we call a zchira to remind us that there's an additional siman, and it's not bedafka these three, but it's also a fourth. And at this point, we assume, says Rav Papa, that Rav Huna, in the light of that brisa, would have removed his original position, because clearly from this brisa, it indicates that one siman is enough. Just the fact that he destroys mammon, when you give him something of value, that's enough to consider him a shota. The brisa doesn't mention any other simanim. And that would prove that we're talking about not individual simanim that have to be piled up and piggyback one on top of the other, but rather each siman on its own is enough and sufficient to generate the same shota. The Gemara vacillates about the following question: when Rav Huna would again rescind his original view, requiring all three simanim, in the light of this new brisa, is mi mekareach suso hudavi haderbe, the damyalaha odil mi kula avi haderbe. One of the three simanim back on daf Gimel Amid Beis is mekareah esk suso. He rips his garments, and that indicates that he's a shota. And certainly in the light of this brisa, Rav Huna would have to admit that even mekareach suso alone, in and of itself, would be sufficient to generate a shem shota and establish him as a shota, because he is a ma'abed mashenosnim lo, he destroys mammon. So this category of mekareach suso is very similar to the category of ma'abed kol mashenosnim lo, because they're both derech hashchasa b'mammon. However, it could be that as far as the other two simanim, which are yotzi echidi balayla and Lon bebeis hakvaras, Rav Huna would still maintain that we need both simanim. Or shall we assume that according to Rav Huna's final position, in light of the brisa as new evidence that came in, each one of the simanim alone independently would be sufficient to generate a psul and a shem shota teku, and we left this as an unanswered question. Now we go back to our Mishnah, establishing that a tumtum and an androgynous would not be chayiv in the mitzvah of re'iyah, that potter from re'iyah. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a brisa. With regard to the mitzvah of re'iyah, shalosh pa'amim b'shana yeroah kol zchurchas pnei Adon Hashem. Now it doesn't say in the pasuk yeroah kol zachur, but rather zachurcha. If it would have said the word zachur alone without zchurcha, then lahotzias hanoshim, it would only establish a source for the exemption of a woman from the mitzvah of re'iyah, that only zcharim are obligated in re'iyah and not nikevos. But now it says zchurcha, and the extra chaf at the end is coming to further the mute, to add to the mute, lahotzi, to exclude tumtum and androgynous. Not only an isha, but even a tumtum and androgynous are exempt from the mitzvah of re'iyah. And then it says kol zechurcha. That's already a ribui to include someone who would have been excluded, and that's l'rabos esaktanim, that they're chayev in re'iyah. Omar Mar, it's something that we derive from this brayso. Zochur lahotzias hanosh. Halam likra michli mitzvah seishman groma who become mitzvah seishman groma noshim turos. Women are exempt from all time-bound mitzvahs, and certainly re'iyah is a time-bound mitzvah. We would have thought neilach re'iyah from Hakil. And in the midst of Hakil, it says, Bebo kol Yisrael leiros. And therefore, we include women in the midst of Hakil. It's Mala Halon, just like in the midst of Halel, of Hakil, we include women, despite the fact that it's a mitzvah seishas man groma. Is here too in the case of the mitzvah of re'iyah, which is equated to the mitzvah of Hakil with Gzeret Shava, Nashim Chayavos. I would say that women are obligated, even though it's a mitzvah seishas man groma, kamash malan. That's why the Torah had to use the word schurcha to exclude women from the chiyuv, the obligation of re'iyah, even though we have this Gzeret Shava equating them to Hakil. So Lamaisa, women are obligated in Hakil, but they're exempt from the mitzvah of re'iyah. Let's go back to the brayso. Zechur chalotzi tumtum androgynous. Bishlei androgynous. I understand why we would have a havmin of an androgynous who has both zachrus and nakfus would be chayiv in re'iyah salkadai kol ve'islei tzad zachrus, since he has the genitals of a male, and therefore he has simoni zachrus. He is a male, and therefore l'chayiv he should be chayiv in the mitzvah re'iyah. Kamash malan. No, we're going to derive from zechurcha that androgynous is exempt. He's part of the mitzvah re'iyah, and the reason is because he is not a zachar and a nekeva, but he's a separate entity, and he's not even a mixas zachar. Elatumtum sfeika. We have a suffix. We don't know if he's a full-fledged zachar, a full-fledged nekeva. Is miyitzrich kro lemute sfeika? Do we need a pasuk to pater from re'iyah someone who's a suffix zachar? Why would we think that he's chayav, and therefore we need an exclusion? And again, the question here is going to be, why don't we apply the principle that applies universally to all suffix oraisa, and we're machmir? So we'll get back to the famous answer to the Turiyevin in just a minute. Omar Abaye, if you were talking about a regular classic tumtum, we don't need a drasha to derive the p'tur from re'iyah. He's only a suffix. We don't know if he's a zachar nekeva. Certainly he would be part. But here, in this brayso, we need a special miyut, kishebeitzav mibachutz. In other words, what's covered here? The gid itself is covered, but the beitzim are bachutz. And in this case of a tumtum shebeitzav mibachutz, the gido tamun, we know that he's a zocher, and therefore we would say he's certainly chayiv in the mitzvah re'iyah. And the Torah is telling me that even this tumtum is part of re'iyah because he's different, and he's not like other zecharim. He's in a category of his own. Getting back to the Turiyevin, he says that our sugya would seem to imply that a suffix doraisa is on a doraisa level is lakula. It's only lechumra midrabanan. And now we understand why the Torah, if it had not patted up a tumtum from re'iyah, we would patter him anyway, midin suffix. However, that might reflect the sheet of the Rambam, but not the Rashba. The Rashba in Kedushin Dafayin Gimel maintains that every suffix doraisa is l'chumra midoraisa, and therefore we don't understand, even if the Torah had not exempt a tumtum from re'iyah, I shouldn't say even, but if the Torah had not exempted, then we would have said he's chayav midin suffix doraisa. So I want to share with you a chidush of the Sfas Emes, that the Gemara's kasha is that since tumtum is a suffix and suffix doraisa l'chumra, and certainly we would say he's chayav b're'iyah. And when the Gemara asks minayin, why would we assume that he's chayav? It meant minayin why would we assume that his chiyuv is b'toras vada? And then you could say that the Torah was memayed him. But here, his chiyuv is b'toras safek. He's a safek zacha. And Tosfos explains that the Gemara's kasha is that since tumtum is a safek, even without a mute, we would say that he's not chayiv in re'iyah because his chiyuv is not b'toras vada. And if his chiyuv is not b'toras vada, he can't possibly bring the carbon, the olas re'iyah, because if he's not chayiv, he's bringing chulun lazara. Omar Mar, kol zechurcha, the ribuy of kol, is the rabbos saktanim. That ktanim are chayiv in the mitzvah of re'iyah. So the Gemara says, is that really possible? Vatnan, in our Mishnah, here at the beginning of Chagigah, it says, Hakol chayovim b're'iyah chutz micherishot b'katan. Rabbi lo kasha kan b'katan she'yeh lechinuch, kan b'katan she'lo yeh lechinuch. The brisa that says that the katan is chayiv in re'iyah, that's a more mature katan who has reached the age that he's roy lechinuch, and therefore for the mitzvah of re'iyah, he's roy lechanchol a mitzvah re'iyah. He can hold on to his father's hand and climb up to Yerushalayim into the Arabites by holding on to his father's hand. But Khan, in our Mishnah that says that a cotton is potter from re'iyah, that's because shalo igia lechinuch. Even if his father would hold on to his hand, he cannot climb up to Yerushalayim. So the Gemara asks, how can you tell me that the Bryce is talking about a cotton? She igia lechinuch. And that's why the Bryce says that he is chayev in re'iyah. A cotton shalo igia lechinuch is potter. Why? Cotton she'igia lechinuch midrabanan hi. How could the Brisa darshan that a cotton is chayiv in re'iyah because, as we interpret, is igil lechinuch? Any kind of obligation incumbent upon a cotton who's igil lechinuch is only drabanan. And here you're talking about kol zechurcha, pasuk in Chumash that comes to be marba cotton. So my answer is enochinami. It's true that the chi of cotton sheigil lechinuch in mitzvah re'iyah is only drabanan. And the Bryce is talking about a cotton sheigil lechinuch who cross machtam alma. We should not derive a din doraisa, chiv doraisa, mitzvah doraisa from this pasuk kol. It's only in a smach. So if it's only in a smachta, what are we going to do with the extra word kol? V'ela krala my asi. What are we going to do with kol zechurcha? What ribu is doraisa? Lichra cherim. Like the opinion mentioned in the brisa in the name of the acherim. And we always assume that acherim is Rabbi Meir. That's a Gemara in Horios. Hisanya, we learned in the brisa acherim omrim hamakametz v'ametzarev nechoshes v'abursiki p'turim min ha're'iyah. These are individuals who are filthy by virtue of their occupation. For example, mekametz is someone who gathers together with his hands the tsoa of klovin, which they use for ibud oros, to tan the hides. And metzarif nechoshes, when he digs out the nechoshes from the karka, again, it's a very despicable smell. And bursi is a person who's ma'abi the oros. These bali malachos have a very strong stench. And the potem mishum chenemar calls churcha, and we interpret kol to mean mishi yochel lalos im kol zechurcha. If he can join together with the body of Klal Yisrael, but yotzu elu she'enim re'uyim lalos im zechurcha, because of the reach rash and nodef mehem, they cannot be ola together with the chaverim, and it's impossible for the chaverim to tolerate that smell, and therefore they are potter from re'iyah. Now, what I don't understand here is Ol Zechurcha is a reboot. Gemara seems to be making an about face here and explaining that the word kol is the basis for the sheet of acherim to pater re'iyah. Then that's not a reboot, that's a mute. And the language is yotzu elu she'ein re'uyim lalos. So what happened here that the Gemara made an about face here? Oh, I see. The reason for the mute, I'm sorry I didn't emphasize this point clearly to myself, is because kol zechurcha means only those who are coming together with kol zechurcha, not these. Now the Mishnah says that noshim v'avodim eino mishuchrorim are potter from re'iyah. Bishleim and noshim kinamoran, it says kol zechurcha. El avodim inolan, what's the basis for the tour of re'iyah in the case of avodim? Amar Avhuna Amar Kra, it says shalosh par b'shani yira kol zechurcha el pnei hadon Hashem. And it means Adon, you only have one master. Misha Einlo El Adon Echad, that's a Ben Chorin, he only has one master, that's the Almighty, he's Chayv and Re'iyah, but Yotza Zeh, the Eved is excluded, Sheyeshlo Adon Acher, that besides Hashem as his master, he also is Meshubad, he is an Eved to another master. And he's excluded from Re'iyah because of Penei Ha'adon Hashem. So Gemara asks the following kasha. Allah Malikro, why do you even bother with this pasuk? It's not necessary. It's redundant. Kol mitzvah isha chayev es ba, eved chayev ba. Kol mitzvah sheina isha chayev es ba, ein eved chayev ba. The Gemara lo mi isha. We have exeret shava. In the case of creases of a get, it says because of law, sefer crease. So emphasize the word law. And in Eved, in Parshas Kedoshim, it says, O chufsha lo nitan la. And the word la appears here in the Parsha of a Shivcha. And the drasha is going to teach us that just like Nashim Puris Mire'iyah, so to Avodim are Potur Mire'iyah. So why then do we need this drasha of Pnei Hadon? Omar Ravina lo nitzucha ella Misha Chetzio Eved v'Chetzio ben Chorin. And by virtue of the fact that half of him, a chelek, is Avdus, then he's potter from Re'iyah. He has the din of an Isha, and just like Nashim P'turis Mire'iyah, so too the Tzad Eved Shebo is potter from Re'iyah. But wait a second. We would have thought that the Tzad Cheresh Shebo is Chayiv in Re'iyah. And that's why we need this pasuk of Adon, that since he has another Adon on the Tzad Evet Shebo, then even the Tzad Cheresh Shebo is pot. And Daiko Nami, we're going to support Ravina from our Mishnah. The Ketani, it says in our Mishnah, Kol P'tur Mi'Re'iyah, and included those who are potter from Re'iyah, it says, Noshim v'avonim she'enim mishuchrorim. What does the Mishnah mean when it says Einam Mishuchrorim? Elam, if you're going to tell me She'edim Mishuchrorim Klal, it means a full-fledged Eved is listening Avonim Stama. Well, why is it necessary to add those words Einam Mishuchrorim? That's totally redundant. An Eved is not Mishuchrorim. And Stam Eved is Einam Mishuchrorim at all. So why did you have to add Eino Mishuchrorim elolav she'eino Mishuchrorim legamre? Umayninu, but they are Mishuchrorim b'misha chetzio Eved chetzi ben chorin shmamim. The Mishnah says that Chiger v'suma v'chole v'zaken is all the above are potur from Re'iyah. On Rabbanu we learned in the Brayso. With regard to the mitzvah of Re'iyah, it says sholosh regolim tochol gli b'shana. And the Torah calls this manim for the chiyuv re'iyah regolim, sholosh regolim. And it's coming to teach us that the din re'iyah depends and is generated by raglayim. Misha yeshlo raglayim, chayav b're'iyah prat levali kabin, those who are amputees, nebuch, and they take a piece of wood and they put it in a moch, in the rush of the raglayim, and they can get from place to place by leaning on this prosthetic leg. But they are excluded from the mitzvah re'iyah, and that's derived from the word regolim. Davar acher is regolim, is coming to teach me prat lechiger. In other words, only someone who has regolim, and that means raglayim, and he's capable of walking, is chayav in re'iyah. That's to exclude a chiger, a lame person. He's solea al raglo, v'eno yochel lahalach al raglo avad, but his legs were not amputated. So according to the Dover Acher, the Pasuk Regolim is coming to exclude a chiger, even though he has his legs, but he's lame. He cannot walk normally. He's solea al ragla. And it probably means that he has a walking stick. Today they call it a walker. And we're going to exclude from Reglolim chole, suma, zaken she'eni yochel lalos b'raglav. If someone can't go from Yerushalayim to the Azora, even if he has Regolim, Raglayim, he cannot walk on those Raglayim without help, without the aid of someone who's taking him, is he's not chayav in re'iyah. He's potter from re'iyah, even though he has raglayim. He cannot walk on his raglayim without some sort of aid. That's what we call ezras dover acher. And he's not chayav in re'iyah. And what it says in our Mishnah, she'eno yochel lalos beraglov, and he's potter from re'iyah lasuye mai. What is the Mishnah coming to add? We already have this enumerated list of a chiger, a chola, suma, and a zaken she'eno yochel lalos beraglov. So why did the Mishnah have to mention eno yochel lalos l'raglav? Omar Rava Lasuye, and here we turn to Daf Dalet Amud Beis, Mefanki. So let's try to understand what Mefanke means.